Hello, my name is Boris Draguk. I am the executive director of the LA Review of Books, which is a co-sponsor of the Leica Lens series. This is the fourth installment of the series. I'm joined here by two experts and one co-director of the series, Rob Pecker, who is the director of Yiddishkeit and holds a PhD in German literature and language, Germanic literature and language. We are also joined by Jim Hoberman, a legendary film critic and scholar, author of a number of books, the latest of which is Make My Day, Movie Culture in the Age of Reagan, as well as by Denise Göktürk, who is a professor of German at UC Berkeley and the author of a monograph on the depictions of America in German cinema, as well as a co-editor of the German cinema book. And we're here to discuss a film by G.W. Pabst from 1931 titled Kameradschaft, Comradeship. And I'm going to ask Robbie to begin our discussion by introducing the film and explaining the choice.
Sure. Well, as we've been talking about throughout the series from the previous three films, we've been sort of following the themes that are most pressing today. We've spent the last three films talking about ideas of community and contagion from Nosferatu through Panic in the Streets and into the last film that we saw, the Yiddish film, The Light Ahead. And one of the things that we've noticed as we've sort of pulled on these threads of themes has just been how these films are often very interconnected and very much tell us something about the times that we live in now. And one of the things that we were thinking about in terms of disaster and community that came up in the last few films sort of piqued my interest or reminded me of this film, especially in the time that we're living in right now, where we felt that the programming here at Yiddishkeit is sort of centered around questions about unconditional solidarity. That's one of our kind of the themes that we're working with all throughout this year, our 25th year. And this film, Kameradschaft, Comradeship by Pabst, really jumped up there in my consciousness. I just remembered it, partly because I think so much of the topic of conversation these days surrounding questions of fascism and resistance and solidarity across borders, I think it reminded me of it. Just actually, I think maybe it was a memory of the first time I ever heard the word fascist, which actually I think was on my father's. My father had a record of songs of the Spanish Civil War, and Ernst Busch, who is the star of our film, sings on that record, and it's such a like both a nostalgic but also like a real memory that I have of somebody singing about fighting fascism and joining together with others across borders and the international brigades and fighting against fascism. And then I was thinking about we had seen Alexander Granach in our previous film Nosferatu, and there's so many elements that just came together that I felt like this film really it's worth watching again, and for as many of us as possible to just take a look at this beautiful film from 1931 about solidarity, about solidarity across borders, and about how we respond to disaster, how we help our neighbors, do we help our neighbors, and questions like that, which I think really come up so strikingly in this film.
Absolutely, it's what we do to help our neighbors and what stands in the way of that, the forces that oppose that effort. But before we get to the themes of the film, you're absolutely right. It is a gorgeous film. I hadn't seen it before, and I've now watched it about 3 times. I really couldn't resist watching it again this early this morning, although I had other things to do. But it's so perfectly paced. And every time I notice a new detail, either a silent detail or a detail of sound, which is another form of barrier here. It's an early sound film, but language is very much a theme of the film. So what I'd like to do is ask Denise to set the scene for us a bit. Tell us a little bit about the German cinema of the period and the world out of which Pabst emerges.
Okay, yeah, thank you for including me in this. This is a pleasure. The film, came out at a time of great instability and crashing stock markets, street fights, rising unemployment. At the end of 1931, there were 6 million unemployed in Germany. So a time of great confusion and contagion. So it resonates in many ways. It premiered on November 17th, 1931 at the Berlin Capitol, and in France in the following January 29th in 1932. And as Robbie already pointed out, the film is a very powerful intervention promoting international solidarity at a time when nationalism and warmongering were on the rise again. And as you already mentioned, Boris, it's an early sound film. And in this period, there were these productions of multilingual films. So the film itself is multilingual. People are speaking French and German. So that already, signals the spirit of internationalism and collaboration. And then also they were producing at that time, very brief period of the early sound era, German, multilingual versions, which were essentially adaptations of the same script, shot on the same set, with the same crew, mostly the same actors, but addressing different audiences. So these were costly productions, so they were only done during those few years of the early sound period. So I'm interested in all this because I teach a course on transnational cinema at Berkeley, which does investigate how national identifications are staged and performed in and around moving images.
And Pabst is in many ways a kind of definitive figure of this movement. He himself is.
Absolutely, yeah. I was gonna get to that. No.
I just can't wait.
Pabst's anti-war film Westfront had opened the previous year, actually, in May 23rd, 1930, channeling the sound of war as one of the first talkies in Germany. Mm-hmm. And my colleague here at Berkeley, Anton Kees, has convincingly argued that most of Weimar cinema's classics were, in fact, driven by shell shock, reworking the trauma of World War I in phantasmagoric dreamscapes. And Westfront, on the other hand, is remembered as the first German film that was explicitly about World War I. And Kameradschaft actually picks up on the anti-war message of Westfront by reenacting the Courier mine accident, which was an actual mine accident in 1906, Europe's worst mining accident that caused the death of over 1,000 miners. He sets the reenactment near the German border, where the German miners decide to go and help their French colleagues who were buried after the explosion. So Kameradschaft, hence, is a border film. In fact, there are multiple borders enacted in the film. The national border between France and Germany, with the border guards who try to regulate the cross-border traffic and prevent the unemployed from seeking work in France. There are impressive shots of the workers walking against the backdrop of the industrial landscape. Then there is the border between work and leisure at the gate of the mine. The factory gate is a crucial site in cinema ever since the Lumiere brothers workers leaving the factory. So, and Kameradschaft ventures in there, enabling a close look at work. And then there are the borders also in people's minds, Germans in a French bar, or German workers asking, who cares about the French? Why do we need to go there? And then there is the border underground, which is broken down by the alternative rescue crew, Alexander Granach, the actor, whom I'm sure Robbie will bring into play. It's ironically reinstalled at the end of the film. Ordnung muss sein.
Yes.
So, sorry, I'm going on a bit, but
no, that's all right.
I have a few more things about Pabst, and then I'll shut up. So then there is the key scene in the film when the sight of a gas mask actually triggers a flashback of war.
Yes.
The war scenes in the mind of the injured French miner. And that makes him fight back the German who comes to his rescue. So that kind of signals that war continues in the mind. Eric Rentschler, actually, who published a volume on Georg Wilhelm Pabst's films, characterizes his cinema as an extraterritorial cinema. I think that's a nice, fitting designation. And also biographically speaking, Pabst did indeed encounter considerable border trouble throughout his life. So he was born in 1885 in Raudnitz on the Elbe in Bohemia, today's Czech Republic. He planned to join the army initially, but he was short-sighted, so he became an actor in Vienna, and he worked in theaters in Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. He made his directorial debut at the Deutsches Volkstheater in New York in 1912. And on his return journey from that engagement, he ran into the outbreak of World War I. And was detained as an enemy alien in France. So for the entire duration of the war, during his internment near Brest, he organized the Kemp Theater there. This experience becomes formative for his close relationship with the French language and culture, which is visible in this film also. In 1919, he returned to Vienna, became artistic director of the Neue Wiener Bühne, and started working on various film productions in the early 1920s. Memorable is The Joyless Street in 1925 with Greta Garbo and Asta Nielsen, which founded his reputation as a social realist. So in general, Pabst tends to be framed as the representative of the new objectivity and as a counter figure to expressionism and to the fantastic fabrications of Weimar cinema. However, I think that that's simplistic, so I think that the flashback scene, for instance, in Kameradschaft, as well as other shots throughout this film, suggests that this opposition doesn't quite hold, the opposition between expressionism and realism, and that the film actually displays a very sophisticated blend of exterior and interior vision of realism and imagination.
Absolutely, it actually looks.
Mhm.
Pardon me, it looks forward to disaster films, but in a very markedly expressionistic way. The shots inside the mines really reflect an expressionistic sensibility, I think.
Exactly that. Yeah. So the mine actually looks very realistic with the explosions and collapsing tunnels and horses and all of it. But it was actually created as a studio set by the designers Erno Metzner and Karl Vollbrecht, who had also worked on Fritz Lang's Metropolis back in 1927. So, yeah, Pabst is also remembered, of course, for his collaborations with Louis Brooks, Pandora's Box, and Diary of a Lost Girl, and for his lawsuit with Brecht and Weil actually sued him over his adaptation of the Three Penny Opera. There were aesthetic differences there. And then in 1933, Pabst was working in France on an international co-production of Don Quixote. Although he openly disdained Hollywood cinema, he moved to the US, where he made only one film with Warner Brothers, A Modern Hero. There were lots of quarrels with Warner Brothers in the process of this production. And then there were 4 screenplays he wrote that never got produced. He returned to France, disappointed. But in 1939, he decided to immigrate to the US. But once again, he was stopped by the outbreak of war during a farewell visit to his mother in Vienna. And also due to health reasons, he could not travel, ultimately stayed in Germany and continued to direct films under the Nazi regime, so that he was later defamed as an opportunist. He died in 1967. So the whole plea for international solidarity and collaboration that the communist actor Ernst Busch voices at the end of Kameradschaft, the whole Kumpel ist Kumpel, we all belong together, we should, stick together. All that resonates with this Central European biography, which was fractured and interrupted by 2 world wars.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that, Précy. It's a perfect introduction to the themes of our discussion. And what I would like to do now is to ask Jim to reflect a little bit more, maybe on Pabst's reputation and the politics that are embedded in this film. Denise hinted at the fact that this was a terrible time in Germany, and as I understand it, the film actually did quite well, was well received in France, but not so well in Germany.
It was received well almost everywhere outside of Germany. I just to reiterate some of the things that Denise said. Pabst is one of the 3 leading directors of German silent film, the others being Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau. And they were all, he may have, even in the 20s, been the most highly regarded, certainly because of his serious social themes. He was also, as Denise pointed out, I mean, it's more useful to think of him as kind of a Habsburg product than German. I mean, so he was, from a more cosmopolitan place, and certainly was more cosmopolitan than either Lang or Murnau, and also more interested in social realism, which is precisely why he was so highly regarded in the 20s, and then less highly regarded afterwards. Also, it has to do with the fact that he returned to Germany, of course, which even though it wasn't his fault, he it was a stain on his reputation. He was really somebody who was interested in naturalism. He was interested in big themes. I mean, he made a movie, Secrets of the Soul is the English title, that was derived in some way from Sigmund Freud. This is in the mid-20s. I mean, he made a movie, the one with Asta Nielsen and the young Greta Garbo, that has to do with the inflation in
Joyless Street.
Joyless Street, yeah, in Germany, and he was also possibly because he had been an actor himself, an excellent director of actors and particularly actresses. So it's quite amazing that he recognized Greta Garbo when she was quite young. He really is the person who discovered Louise Brooks, and who then, although people didn't realize it at the time, now seems to be, arguably maybe the greatest of silent film actresses. Although Asta Nielsen is also wonderful. He even got a relatively unnarcissistic performance out of Leni Riefenstahl in one of his films. So I think that this is important because he was interested in stars in some respect, but he shifted when sound came in, and West Front 1918 is interesting because it's really a kind of ensemble film, and this was the film that addressed the trauma of the war. And it seems to have been also, although I don't know this for sure, that he was thinking a lot about the Soviet directors, and that may have had some impact on his, Eisenstein in particular, in focusing not on a single protagonist so much as on a group. And West Front 1918 was populated to some degree by actors who had been in the war, and so in a way it's a kind of psychodrama because people were reenacting this trauma. Also, it was taken as Krakauer writes about it. It's practically a documentary, and it clearly is not a documentary. I mean, how could it be? But
yes,
but it had that authority, and that's something that also came from the Soviets, because Potemkin had a far greater impact in Germany than it ever did in the Soviet Union. I mean, that's really where it landed, and so he had to have been thinking about that. And I was interested in going back and looking at the reviews of the early reviews of say it for me. Comradeship, yes. How often Potemkin comes up, and that made me think. Also, because I agree that you can't just see him as a representative of the new objectivity. That this film is a kind of strange amalgam of Potemkin and Metropolis, like these two monuments of silent cinema. Although, of course, the interest in Metropolis, a lot of that comes out in the sound. The sound of the machines is really quite something. So this film, I think, comes directly out of West Front 1918, because that film was all about transcending borders and the futility of war. And there's a scene which it's been a while since I saw the film, but I think there's this incredible scene where there's a German soldier who's dying in a shell, and he reaches out and he finds the hand of somebody, and it's a French soldier who he doesn't realize is also dead. I mean, it's an incredible image of him, like holding a corpse's hand for comfort, and possibly he's blinded by it. Anyway,
The other Soviet film that came
Yeah.
to mind as I watched West Front was The End of St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
St. Petersburg by
Pudovkin,
Pudovkin.
yeah. So I think that what he did was this is the extension of that, and that he goes from the kind of pacifism and internationalism, and he tries to move it in the direction of socialism.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the thing that's in a way the most problematic about the film for many people, because his view of class solidarity is, could be seen as naive in some
Mm-hmm.
respects. I mean, given the importance of the mine owner, even though the mine owner, when it's up to him, he's, it's natural, it's natural that we should help, the French comrades. I mean, that seemed possibly to be to miss the point, the class struggle here and so on. Although that became more apparent retrospectively. Now, it's interesting that the film did not do well in Germany. Audiences really didn't want to see this, and there could be any number of explanations for it. I mean, maybe they just were not ready for this to look at this kind of catastrophe on screen. I don't know for sure, but it's striking that the movie did so much better outside of Germany, and even Krakauer, when he wrote about it, at least as far as I know, he's writing about it in 1946 or 1947. He's writing about it after the war, and then people's view of it changed. So he's quite critical of it. But in the UK and in France, where they had their own version, and probably we should explain that there were two versions of the film, and that the one that we see is a kind of amalgam of the two, because there were actually different things in these films. So, but it did very well in France, and it did extremely well in New York. In fact, the New York critics, who were interested in foreign films, thought it was a masterpiece. They thought it was really, like one of the greatest German films that there is. The Times Review, one of the finest examples of realism that has come to the screen. And we should say that for an early talkie, it's so sophisticated in its use of sound. I mean, really very impressive. And saying before, I wonder how much of that is due to the German sound system, which they use, because Lang's early sound films are also quite creative. Now, but just say a couple more things about its reception in the United States, which has to do with it as a socialist film. Insofar as I can tell, radicals in New York, which is to say communists, loved it. They also thought that it was a masterpiece, and it was revived quite a lot in New York in the 1930s at little theaters. I mean, sometimes it would be showing with something like Cocteau's The Blood of a Poet, I mean, because it was also an art film. But, the Daily Worker will always make a mention of it. They always will direct people to see it. And in fact, Pops, I guess, when he left Hollywood, he was still around in the United States, or he was coming back. I mean, he showed up on several occasions to introduce the film. When it was shown at like a workers' school or something like that, it was just, it was just like an avant-garde filmmaker now going around with their work and giving a little lecture on it. And it was so beloved that this even continued into the war. I mean, there's in 1939, The Worker has one of their articles on it. They're calling it the greatest of pre-Hitler films. I mean, and then in 1941, after the war has begun, they refer to it as the film Hitler couldn't kill, because it was banned, obviously, in Germany by the Nazis. And this struck me, because by then Pabst is back in Germany, and I think that they must know that he's making movies there, and they were willing to let that go. But after the war, there was a revaluation of the film by emigres, Krakauer, and also by British critics, and they began to they basically called it naive. They didn't think that the that the worker solidarity was convincing. Krakauer's is actually more interesting for what he's saying about himself than what he says about the film. He blames it. He thinks it's like a kind of soft-headed social democratic, illusion. And how could you make this film when, like the Nazis were already in the streets and so on? So he's reinscribing what happened afterwards back into the movie, which is not exactly fair. The corollary to that is that after the war it becomes recognized as a great formal film. I mean, that's what people choose to dwell on. And I'll just say, as far as I can tell, Pabst never really gets over what happened. That escapes from the fact that he wound up back in Germany making films for the Nazis, even though he certainly was denazified. Nobody accused him of being a Nazi, and he made several films after the war that.
And one of them. Yeah, one of which Hitler is on his last leg.
Yes, but it didn't matter. It's like his early reputation, I think, was gone, and it's only, I don't know if I want to say lately, but it's certainly in general he's just not as well known now as the two other German filmmakers, despite the fact that his career is extremely interesting throughout the 30s and beyond.
Would you say it's the star vehicles that people usually revisit now, especially the Brooks films?
Well, it's Louise Brooks, I think, but of course, she was not. That's something that's a late development, also, because she was completely unappreciated in the United States, and to a degree in Germany too. It was kind of avant-garde to have this American flapper play their precious Lulu. This German. I mean, how could little did they know, that this, what this actress was capable of. But Pabst obviously did.
Yes. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the naivete of this vision of comradeship, and also perhaps maybe some of the hidden sophistication. And I'll ask Robbie to reflect on that. How do you understand the politics of this film? And yes,
I think that it's the naivete piece of it really seems retrospective. I mean, when we think back on the period, one of the things that I think is so complex about the film in its period and its ideological view is in fact that he's drawing from a pool of actors, mostly who are part of, and writers who are part of the Piscator theater, which was an avant-garde leftist theater that was thriving in the years before this film was made. And the whole collective of writers, which included Brecht and also included people like Rappaport and Leo Lanya, who were involved in other projects of Lang and also of Pabst, are all coming from that same, and of course Granach as an actor and Ernst Busch as an actor, are both performing in the years before this, not exclusively, but in many productions by the Piscator Theater. And I think that that's a piece of it that we have to remember, that those plays, things like Ernst Toller's Obla wir leben, other early Brecht plays, which are produced there, and feature these actors, are really, they're the avant-garde. They're the complexity of the productions are incredible. I mean, the fusion of film and theater in the Piscator Theater is one of the most famous aspects of that theater, right? The projections onto the proscenium and in the backdrops, that kind of incredible technical fusion, these new technical leaps in theatrical production. And yet, at the end of almost all the productions between 1927 and I think 1929, or maybe even earlier, every production ends with the collective singing of the Internationale at the end of every production. And we can think back and think, that's a kind of a naive communist, class reading this kind of this proletarian theater. But I don't think that in the moment that was felt that way at all. I think that this film, which comes right after a series of plays that feature both Ernst Busch and Granach, including plays like Kaufmann from Berlin, and many plays that kind of were really, diving into the meat of avant-garde proletarian theater, which I think, yeah, we definitely can look back and say that the class outlook or the class perspective seems, heavy, ham-fisted, or that it seems very simplistic. And it's reflected, I think, in Ernst Busch's final speech at the end, the Kumpel is Kumpel speech, but that we all belong together kind of moment that he has there at the end. It really feels like it's part of the atmosphere that's coming out of the theatrical moments at Nollendorfplatz, like at the Piscator Theater in Berlin. It's really part and parcel of that cultural moment that's creating that theater and that film, that it infuses the body of this film in that way. So I would reject that kind of idea about it being naive. I mean, I think that it's easy to say that after after the year, after Stalin, after everything, that we can look back and say, oh, this kind of outlook, we would never imagine a group of people, the actors leading the audience in the singing of the Internationale at the end of a play. But that is a part of what was considered to be, great technical and complex masterpieces of the German stage during this period, right around the time of the release of this film.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, go on, Jim.
No, I was going to say that I think that I agree with you that it's a retrospective take on it, but I don't think it has to do with Stalin. I think it has to do with Hitler. The fact that Pabst became tainted, and I mean, as I said, like the the Daily Worker is not known for like in a way it's and this played right to them. And it's funny because now people will throw up something like Kula Vampa, the Brecht film. Oh, that's much more sophisticated. That's what I mean. No, I mean in its time, like The Worker never would have gotten. I mean, that would have been incomprehensible to them. So but I think that maybe, although the Popular Front didn't exist in 1931, that this is kind of anticipates that form of solidarity.
I think that's a very good point. And what would you say, Denise? What was the afterlife of this kind of vision of solidarity in German cinema in the 1930s? Was this the beginning or the end of this kind of thing?
It was shortcut, of course.
Yes.
Shortly after this, it all collapses, and
yes,
so it takes a totally different direction. I mean, in some ways, I'm surprised that that German audiences didn't appreciate this, because the Germans look pretty good in this film. So they actually, they are in possession of the more advanced technology. And if you look at their mine and the shower room there and all that,
Yes.
it's pretty, pretty technologically advanced, and also they then show the spirit of wanting to go and help, and the workers do actually. So I mean, in a way, Germany should have embraced this.
Yeah, and they're friendlier than the French.
yes.
I mean, even this,
They like to have fun, and they were friendly.
That's right. Yeah.
So the reason it was banned and all that was probably because of the participation of Jewish and communist actors in this production, and the Jewish producer and all that, So, and the internationalist spirit of tear down borders. But I actually don't find it that naive, I have to say, because I think it doesn't end with the speech that Ernst Busch delivered.
That's it. That's right.
Mhm.
It ends with the reinstallment of the border underground. So there's that sort of tongue-in-cheek scene which suggests that of course the authorities will prevail, and they will kind of re-erect those borders, and Ordnung muss sein, and protocols are signed, and so So the spirit of international collaboration always is up against that bureaucracy.
Or wasn't that only in one version? I don't think is it only in the French version?
I'm not. No, well.
I mean, I remember the note that comes with the film production that
Yeah.
says that the final sequence was lost, and they took it from the French print of the film. But I don't know if that scene, because it seems so important to have it.
Yes.
I mean, I've never seen the original German version vis-a-vis the original French version. You know, at this point, we are looking, of course, at the, digital mediations of this film. I don't know when the DVD came out, 2008 or so. I mean, there was a rediscovery around then. There was also the Berlin Film Festival showed a digitally remastered version as part of a retrospective. But that would be interesting work to actually compare those two versions.
But as Robbie says, it is hard to imagine that scene ending with that rousing speech and the promise of collaboration for eons to come. I think the undercutting, the literally undermining of that scene is the resolution of the chord.
I'm just asking that because according, I found some notes for when it was shown some years ago at the Museum of Modern Art, and I don't know who wrote who wrote the notes are not signed, so I don't know who was doing it. But they talk about how it's not just that the restored version draws on gets the last sequence from the French cut. They're suggesting that there were changes, that they were subtly different, that the two movies were different in some ways, and that would be, like what would that, and there's also the possibility that for one reason or another they changed it. That's not unheard of in Germany, especially that they would, look what happened to Metropolis. I mean, it was shown one way, at the Ufa Palast or wherever it opened, and then right away they began, making changes.
I think there are two different versions out there, so there's one on Amazon Prime, and then there's one on YouTube, and the one on YouTube I think is the French version, and it is, you can already tell that there are some differences there, but one would really need to do some philology to follow up.
That's right. We're about 18 minutes away from the end of our discussion. So if anyone has any questions, please do make sure to leave them in the comments section, and I'll elevate them. So if you have any questions for our experts, please do pop them in. In the meantime, I'd like to ask about some of the cinematic devices that Pabst uses in order to deliver these themes, and I'm fascinated by the use of language here, and I'm fascinated by the way that language is almost a kind of a musical system here, where people come together and flow apart, come together. It's a different scale, and maybe you could reflect a little bit on that. How must this have played for audiences for whom sound was new? It's a very sophisticated use of multilingual scripts.
I think Alexander Granach actually is a really interesting figure, or the Kasper figure played by Granach in the film that way, because he is deliberately set up as a translator.
Yes.
So,
exactly.
So he, when the three of them, who are the kind of, they are the Volkstheater sidekicks to the more earnest, solidaric operation. So when we see them first going to a French bar.
Yes.
And ordering beer there, they are struggling, and he comes in as the translator. So
that's right.
He's the mediator figure. He also then prevents a pub.
A brawl. That's right. So language is one of the bridges.
And has his rabbit as some. I don't. That's. That was interesting.
That's
he brought his rabbit to the bar, but
yes.
And later on, when those three are underground, tearing down the border in the mine, he, I think, oh, and later on they're trapped. And miraculously they find a telephone that and they're calling, and once again he comes in as the translator to explain to the people up there where they are and so on. So there are these, there are the two languages which not everyone in the audience would probably
exactly that's what's so fascinating
in these in their language. And in fact, Ernst Busch plays on that too in his speech, saying, "I didn't understand anything my colleague said, but I understood the spirit."
Right.
Something like that.
And that seems to be a very sophisticated use of language in early sound cinema.
Oh, it's quite brilliant, because I think that he really understood language as in talkies as a kind of material thing.
Exactly.
That it had, that it would have just the sound of French would for a German audience would have a special meaning, even if they didn't understand what people were saying. And the sound design is great with all the, in the mine and in the town and so on. But one of the things that is characteristic of early talkies, and I'm particularly familiar with this in the United States, but I would guess that it's true everywhere, is that people got a kick out of foreign accents and funny delivery. Take Peter Lorre, for example, Bela Lugosi. They really became stars because of their voices.
Yes.
And I think that it had a lot to do with Mae West too, and Fields. There was a moment where voices were intensely interesting.
Yeah, they had voices.
And for their sound, yes, that's right, exactly, and for their sound quality. And I think that's, I really think that he is under-recognized as a extremely early adapter and creative figure in
precisely
sound.
That's what struck me most, because I'm a great fan of pre-code American cinema, but all of the key scenes happen over a flower pot with both people leaning in, and because there's a microphone hidden there. And here everything is just perfectly orchestrated. It couldn't be more elegant.
Yeah. One other thing about the play with language that's so interesting also is this this moment that happens also with Alexander Granach at the end, where there's a play with that. There's this idea about not understanding the other, and when the truck of French miners comes over to greet them, Casper, the character, is saying, "Where's my mortal enemy? Where's my mortal enemy?" And he picks up the child and he kisses him, and he's saying, "Here's my enemy. Here's my enemy." And it's this very interesting moment in the film where the language that he's using in German, that's explicitly calling the French the enemy, is also the object of his embrace. So there's a kind of a cinematic that in a silent film we would never know that he's calling him and his enemy, but he is calling him explicitly, "This is my enemy," but he hugs him. And it's just a very beautiful moment with the play with language right there, I think, with the false translation or the non-translated.
Absolutely. And there's a question in the comments or an observation. It's a question with 3 dots, but the question is, so there were no subtitles? How were these films shown abroad?
Well, certainly in the United States, there were subtitles. I don't know how it was shown in if they subtitled the French for German audiences or the German for French audiences.
It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure right now. Yeah, whether they had somebody talking or subtitles.
Yeah, they actually forced the piano player to do live translation.
Yeah.
And there's another good observation here by Daniel Saunders, and maybe we can pop that up here. "I thought the French and German bureaucrats signing paperwork in exactly the same manner over the reinstalled mine border at the end was a subtle comment on how Kameradschaft runs both ways, not just among workers, but among the more elite classes." I think that's a very good observation. That is a great irony. And of course, this film is two-tiered. There's above ground and below ground, and that is a metaphor in itself. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, that's what I meant by the resolved chord. That the fact that the elites step in as the workers are establishing their solidarity. Those are really the two storylines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about like the songs that actually Ernst Busch is most famous for singing after this film. I mean, not just the song in Kule Wampe, which is the Solidarity song, but shortly after this, I guess it's probably from 1934, Ernst Busch's most famous song is the song, the Einheitsfrontlied, the Song of the United Front. And one of the things that he sings in that is this line where he says, you know, what we don't want, what we know a worker doesn't want is for it to know that there are people this is by Brecht. He says that there are people toiling or slaving underneath them, and that there are these masters who are above them. And then you have that kind of exact juxtaposition in this film, that these are the things that both of these things are in opposition to one another. And in the film, they're shown exactly cinematically that there are. And it's a kind of inverting of that,
yes,
where the masters are now the people who are underground in this really interesting way.
Absolutely, it's the mole people. You know, there's almost a paranoid vision of the evil elite. And there's a comment by Benjamin Pletcher that's also, I think, worth foregrounding. Speaking of the film's retrospective naivete, I found the portrayal of international solidarity much more complex than usually presented by an array of motivations, including national pride and competition. And I think what Robbie said about that scene with "Here's my enemy, here's my enemy" is a good example of that. But yes, I think that there is tension. That scene at the bar is also a scene of potential havoc.
Right.
Yeah. And one more question. This is from Tomek Adler. The film has such striking expressionist cinematography. Can you talk about the visual style of the film? Maybe Jim can reflect on that a little bit.
Well, I mean, the film is quite amazing in having, you know, this kind of quasi-documentary objective view of the town, which I would imagine, you know, is a mining town that he went to, and then the underground, where it's still hard to believe that that's a set. But of course, you know, you couldn't do this kind of things with the lighting and you know, with the choreographed demolition and so on, unless it was under very controlled you know, conditions. So I think that he's able to bring these two things together, and it's I mean, a lot of the formal power of the film comes from the interplay of, you know, the upper world and the lower depths, you know, the expressionist world, and then bound together by the use of sound. But he does other things too. I mean, I'm very struck by his how fluid the camera can be.
Oh yes,
and you know, which again is kind of unusual for a movie that, you know, in 1931, you know, an early sound film where they have to worry about that. But you know, they're very good at post dubbing. I mean, he had figured that, you know, unlike, you know, the Hollywood, where the joke is, you know, that it has to, they're recording everything, you know, as it happens, rather than, you know, dropping the sound in later. I mean, he had no problem with that. But there's one shot in this when the train comes in and the townspeople are running kind of at an angle to the train. They're both in motion. And that is a phenomenal shot. That's very Pudovkin-like, actually.
Yes, very Pudovkin.
But you know, it still is, you know, dramatically, you know, fabulous.
Absolutely. I mean, it takes the Lumiere formula far into the future. Absolutely. Yeah. And the same goes for that, again, that scene in the bar where they enter, and in the foreground you see those talking heads, but all your focus is behind the talking heads as they walk past. Really sophisticated camera work. Well, I would like to ask one more question of all three of you. And it's a kind of a two-part question. How does this film, do you feel, how does it add to the development of our series? How is it in conversation with the films, any of the films that we've screened, and in what way? And also, how does it play in our current moment? Does it say anything about where we are now? So you can answer either part of that, and I'll begin with Jim.
Well, I mean, the first thing that I thought of, since we're in a in a moment of like an international crisis, living in a country which is hyper nationalistic and xenophobic. I mean, do I remember correctly that China or the WHO offered to send supplies to us, and we turned it down? I mean, that's something to think of when you look at this somehow natural, healthy, and human. This kind of cooperation or solidarity seems, as opposed to a place where it's seen as evil and destructive.
Where just today, our leader tells China that it will pay a great price for what it has done to the world. Yeah.
To him, I guess.
Yeah.
He means to him.
The world is a
I thought it was a blessing that he got. Didn't he say that it was like God, a gift from God? But
a gift from God, but a curse from China.
Yeah.
That's two things can coexist in his mind. And Denise, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean that's a very obvious connection to today. And I also thought it really makes us think about sort of the shifting geographies of labor and resources. So at the beginning, there are these amazing shots of the industrial landscape and the workers moving across the border, or sort of trying to move across the border. And I think one of them says, look at these piles of coal, but they won't be able to sell them. So something, so in a way, there's the whole, also the energy that is produced there, but where is it going?
Yes.
And also the labor markets, which are in flux, all that resonates also with today, right?
Absolutely.
Didn't somebody argue that coal was really the reason for the entire debacle, Hitler's rise and the Third Reich? So that resonates. I can't really speak to the entire series. I do know that you watched Nosferatu initially.
Yes.
And I mean, I could see some links there in terms of visual experimentation also, and sort of take on cinematic mobility.
Yeah.
Yes.
Metropolis is an obvious kind of comparison, I guess, also with the above and below.
Yes.
I don't think you have that in your program, but that resonates. Although I think this film has more power today.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, Metropolis, it's all good with the robot dancing, but I've seen it once too many times.
Yes. And Robbie, I think you'd agree that it is very much in keeping with both the visual and the thematic template that the other films have set. That light and dark, the rapid movement and spread of either disease or disaster, and rapid mobilization. All of these are the themes and the visual images that we've been.
I mean, it's also interesting that we speak a lot of, I think, in over the course of our series about what's going on behind the camera and what's presented to our viewers, and the relations between those as being so complicated and interesting. And that's happening here in this film, I think, too, where we have, if we're talking about transcultural, transnational, translingual cinema, we have all these people behind the camera on this film, who actually, from a Yiddishkeit perspective, many of whom come from, the Galicia or Bohemia from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from the provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Yiddish speakers, Czech speakers, but a lot of Yiddish speakers in particular, who end up and become part of the cultural Parnassus that was Berlin and German cinema during this period, and are making a film about cross-border solidarity at the same time, which is not addressing questions about what's happening inside Germany exactly with those minorities at that moment inside Germany. And I think that's a very interesting thing to look at, the way that we see this mobility of creativity, and the ways that it gets screened to us or projected to us back. And that's one of the things that I think I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, especially with all the discussion of essential workers. And we have this film about people who are actually powering the world, and they're underground, and they are victims of catastrophe and of disaster. And what do we do for those people who are bringing life to everybody else, and bringing light to everybody else? And how do we respect that? How do we honor it? And how do we look at it in a world without borders, without boundaries? And how do we have that kind of empathy? How do we cultivate that kind of empathy for workers across borders today? That really strikes me as one of the things that comes out of this. That's also been, I think, throughout many of the films that we have seen over the course of this pandemic.
Well, I think those are beautiful closing words, and I think that one of the first steps is to have conversations like this, and to participate in conversations like this, to ask those difficult questions, which these films help us do. Thank you, all of you, again, for this fascinating discussion, and we'll be announcing our new film shortly.
Absolutely.
So long from now.
Thank you so much.